The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark.
Glory to you, O Lord.
When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him, and he stayed close to the sea. One of the synagogue officials named Jairus came forward. Seeing him, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him, saying, "My daughter is at the point of death. Please come lay your hands on her, that she may get well and live." He went off with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed upon him. There was a woman afflicted with hemorrhages for 12 years. She had suffered greatly at the hands of many doctors and had spent all that she had. Yet she was not helped, but only grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. She said, "If I but touch his clothes, I shall be cured." Immediately her flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Jesus, aware at once that power had gone out from him, turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who has touched my clothes?" But his disciples said to him, "You see how the crowd is pressing upon you, and yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. The woman, realizing what had happened to her, approached in fear and trembling. She fell down before Jesus and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be cured of your affliction." While he was still speaking, people from the synagogue official's house arrived and said, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher any longer?" Disregarding the message that was reported, Jesus said to the synagogue official, "Do not be afraid. You have faith." He did not allow anyone to accompany him inside except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they arrived at the house of the synagogue official, he caught sight of a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. So he went in and said to them, "Why this commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but asleep." And they ridiculed him. Then he put them all out. He took along the child's father and mother and those who were with him and entered the room where the child was. He took the child by the hand and said to her, "Talitha koum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." The girl, a child of 12, arose immediately and walked around. At that they were utterly astounded. He gave strict orders that no one should know this and said that she should be given something to eat. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Once upon a time, a deaf man, a blind man, and a disabled man, all of whom were dear friends, had heard a story that in their town, Jesus had appeared in a particular church and was performing healing services. So they were astounded at this story, and like most people, were very curious and hopeful, in fact, and so they decided to go to this church to see if it was true. So sure enough, they came upon this church in the center of town. It was packed. The parking lot was full. No sooner they went inside, and they could barely make it in, they could see Jesus up in the front of the church healing people. So they were very excited. So they kind of waited their turn to get closer and closer and closer. So finally they were close to where Jesus was. And Jesus looked and saw this deaf man, and he says, "Can I help you, son?" And the deaf man signed to Jesus and said, "I would be happy if I could hear again." Well, Jesus knew sign language, so he said, "Okay." And he reached forward and he touched the man's ears. Boom, the man could hear again. Well, there was the blind man. And so Jesus walked up to him and tenderly whispered in his ear, and he said, "My brother, what can I do to help you?" And he said, "Jesus, if you can, I want to be able to see." And so Jesus touched both of his eyes. Boom, they were opened up and he could see. Well, Jesus sees this man sitting in a wheelchair, and he looks at him. He walks up to the guy and he asked him, he says, "You know, what can I do for you? What do you want of me today?" Well, the man wheeled himself back a few feet and he yelled at Jesus and said, "Don't lay one finger on me because I'm on disability." There's some people even Jesus can't help. And that brings us to our gospel today. A passage that we find here in Mark chapter 5, but it also appears in Luke chapter 8 and Matthew chapter 9. And in biblical studies, that means pure and simple. For a story to be repeated by multiple gospels, it means it was a treasure chest for the early church. It was obviously told over a wide geographical area, and a lot of people had a lot of love for this story, and no wonder why. Mark, as he tells this story, uses a technique in order to get the point across, because remember back then, people didn't have technology as we do today. So you told stories, and you hoped that people could get the details. And so Mark loves to tell his miracle stories using what we call doublets, two stories combined into one. And if you notice, these stories are connected by a couple things. The little girl who has died is 12 years old. The woman's been hemorrhaging for 12 years. On the other hand, both people who seek Jesus' help are told that their faith is what's going to make the sick person well. So faith and healing are very important for Mark. Now, as the story opens up, Jesus is still in Galilean territory. We're told that all of a sudden, after he's been teaching all day, a man by the name of Jairus comes before him and falls down on the ground before him begging. Now, Mark tells us he is a synagogue official, and that is huge. To give us some perspective, it's like having a bishop and a governor in the same position. This man was powerful, and that he fell down before Jesus begging. This is the guy who gives orders and people kneel down before him. But that's not all. This man would have been looked upon as incredibly unusual, to say the least. Because you see, the Jewish leadership at the time held Jesus in contempt. He came from a little podunk town up north called Nazareth, and everybody knew nothing worth anything came out of Nazareth. And so who is he? I mean, just some preacher, some charismatic preacher, a country bumpkin, if you will. And so the fact that Jairus is falling down before Jesus to beg him, I'm sure these other people are thinking, what in the world is this guy doing? Why is he lowering himself to perform such a humiliating gesture before this country bumpkin? But you see, you who are parents know exactly what it is. You would walk many miles, fly all around the world if you had to, if you thought that somebody could help one of your kids that was suffering, huh? Yeah. And so Jairus is desperate. He's heard something about Jesus, and so he comes to Jesus and he pleads and he says, "Help me, my daughter is dying, help me." Notice what Jesus does. He doesn't ask for his ID card. He simply moves on out to help Jairus. On his way there, he encounters a huge crowd of people. But within that crowd is an interesting person. A woman, we are told, her name is never given, unlike the important Jairus. She's unnamed. But she's been suffering for 12 years from some sort of hemorrhaging. What exactly it is, we do not know. For Mark, it's not germane to the story. The woman's desperate. And notice what happens. She knows she's not supposed to be touching another human being for ritual reasons. But in desperation, she reaches out to Jesus in order to get help. And she is made well. What's the point of these two stories? Number one, Jesus has time for people. I know that may sound like an unusual point, but he has time for people. And it's kind of incredible that he does, because you see in Mark's gospel, Jesus has been one busy Messiah, I'm telling you. From the moment that John the Baptist baptized him in the Jordan River, Jesus went to work in chapter 1. Time after time in chapter 1, he's healing people who have been possessed by demons. Over and over again, he's performing exorcisms, and the people get well just like that. Then he starts curing people with various illnesses. Peter's mother-in-law, for instance, who's paralyzed, and a man who's paralyzed. Jesus heals him just like that as well. He's busy. He's busy. But notice he takes time to hear Jairus' plea. In fact, he is willing to break from his scheduled routine to go with Jairus to his house. Why not just say, okay, your daughter's going to be fine from a distance? No, Jesus made time for Jairus, but he also made time for the hemorrhaging woman too. He could have blown her off. After all, he was already on a mission when she intruded into his life and his schedule. But for Jesus, even though the world didn't see this woman as important, he did. Secondly, Jesus has time for losers. For losers. This woman, this hemorrhaging woman, was a loser. And in a number of regards. First of all, she was busted broke. She had spent all her money with all kinds of doctors trying to get herself well, and it didn't work. She was a loser. She lost all of her money. But she had also lost her husband too. And you know why? Because ritually, for a woman to be bleeding, to have any kind of an illness of that sort, would have made her ritually unclean, which meant not only was she not allowed to sleep in the same bed as her husband, she wasn't allowed to stay in the same house as her family. She was almost like a leper, for goodness sake. She lost her family and her friends because that's what the ritual law said had to happen. So she was a real loser in that regard. And thirdly, she had lost her identity. She was a sinner in everybody's thinking, because stuff like that only happened to people who had committed sins. And so in the eyes of the world, she was a real loser. But Jesus took time to reach out to her. Thirdly, Jesus takes time to affirm people. Notice what he said to this woman. Power went out from him for sure. She is healed just like that for sure. And notice what he calls her. Daughter. 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 You see, to be a daughter, you have to be a part of a family. And even though her own family had cut her off because of her illness, even though the worshiping community would not allow her in the synagogue because she was unclean, Jesus said, no. In the eyes of my Father, you are a daughter. You are one of us again. He took the time to affirm who she was. But my favorite point, and something I love dearly about Jesus, one thing he didn't have time for, naysayers and negativity. He didn't have any time for that. And we see that supremely manifest when he goes into Jairus' house. First of all, before he goes into the house, there's the typical chorus of people outside the house wailing and singing dirges. Dirges. That's what they did. They were people who actually had groups who went about, and if you had a death in your family, they would stand outside your house and go, oh, the whole time. And they usually sang off key. So there they were. Look what Jesus says. Get out of here. Scram. I don't want to hear that stuff. That's not my song. That's not what we sing around here. And then he goes into the front entrance of the house. And if that's not enough, getting rid of the band, there's people inside there who are looking and saying, what's he doing here? The girl's dead. She's dead. Why is he bothering to come here? If he's anybody, he would have known that she was already dead. And what can he do? She's dead. You can't get much deader than dead. You know what Jesus says to them? Get out of here. I don't want to hear that stuff. And then he walks up to the little girl, and he simply takes her hand and says to her, "Little girl, arise." And she does. You see, it's incredible how much negativity is around us all the time. You know, if you could really take some time off from your life and make a retreat for a couple days, for a week, let's say, you would be stunned at the lack of negativity out there. Now, you'd have to do it as a silent retreat. You'd have to get rid of the television, the radio, and all that other kind of stuff. But you know, we're constantly bombarded with negative stuff. If it's not gossip and slander and rumors, but look at the media. You know, they don't sell newspapers without having bad stories on the front cover. Happy stories don't sell, you see. So we have to put dirt and smut and tragedy and heartbreak and sickness and everything on the front covers and throughout the news story in order to get people's attention. And it pollutes us. We hear so much negative all the time. But you see, Jesus didn't have time for that. His job was to bring healing. His job was to bring life. His job was to make people whole again. Even when the world said, can't do it, never work. Who do you think you are? Jesus showed them all. He raised that little girl and cleared up the lady who was hemorrhaging. What's the point for us? So many times in this life, when we find ourselves in desperate situations, we really feel as though Jesus abandons us. We believe that though we pray to him, nobody's listening, nobody's home. And the truth is, he is always listening. The reason the early church loved this story and passed it on from generation to generation is because they knew people need to hear the truth that Jesus has time for us. He has time for you. And you may say to yourself, yeah, but my concern's not all that big. Don't say that to Jesus, because you are one of his. Your concern is his concern. Now, he will teach you the difference between what you want and what you need. But the bottom line, he has time. The question is, do we make time for Jesus?